welcome to another Kobo Writing Life Live Q&A. This month, we're joined by Ruthie Bowles. Thanks, Ruthie, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And welcome to the audience that are coming in. Let us know where you're coming from in the chat. We just had our pre-chat about the weather, where we're both coming on the other end of heat waves that are happening in our corresponding cities. So you're nice and cool where you are, Ruthie, hopefully.
Yeah. I'm in my basement in my booth, which is definitely cooler than outside.
I'd imagine the audio booth is actually does it get stuffy in there?
Oh, yeah, it gets so warm in here. We have extensive conversations about, and when I say we, other audiobook narrators, we have these extensive conversations about ice vests and ice packs and all that type of stuff. It's a little harder to go live and narrate in the summer because you don't want to get banned for not wearing enough clothes, but it gets warm in here.
And it's not like you have the luxury of having a fan running.
Exactly.
Nice. Well, thanks so much. Welcome. Richard is in New York, so also experiencing the heat wave. I'd imagine that's coming to hopefully to the end of things. But so, Ruthie, I'm going to read your bio. And if you have any questions throughout, people that are viewing, please let us know in the chat and I'll pop them up and try and get to them as best we can. So Ruthie is an Army veteran and former translator from Southern California who now calls Central Maryland her home. If she's not in her sound booth, just like today, recording awesome audiobooks, you can find her hiking in the trails near her house, playing with her kids, and of course, reading a book. No Market for That Book is Ruthie's company and is dedicated to helping more diverse and inclusive stories make their way into the world through narration services and manuscript consultation. Ever interested in building community, No Market for That Book also supports bookish businesses through crisis management and communications consulting that focuses on clarity, accountability, and repair. And we'll dive into all of this, and I'm so happy to be chatting with you today.
Well, like I said, I'm really happy you guys reached out and invited me. At first, I was worried it was a scam, so somehow, because I was like, not me, they don't want to talk to me, but here we are.
I'll have to. Well, I'm glad that we passed your spam check. So let's get started. We just had some sort of. I'm just going to pop these up. That Ruthie is the best, and we can attest to that as well. So for anyone that's watching who isn't familiar with you personally, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work in the book industry and just how you got into working in this industry?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Everybody loves how I got into the industry. They love that story because it's just it's kind of predicated on my years of doing other things. You mentioned when you read my bio, I was a Army veteran. Well, I am an Army veteran. I was a U.S. Army soldier. And that was my first career, and I did that for about 10 years. And then my second career, I was a marketing consultant. And then audiobook narration is my third career. And much to some people's surprise, I think less so to other audiobook narrators because we're starting to get a feel for how other people get into this industry. But I'm one of the people who didn't have any performance experience whatsoever when I decided that I was going to give this a go. I had a love of reading and then the many assurances on almost a daily basis from my husband that I was super dramatic. And I figured if I could put those two things together, then I could possibly find some people who would like the way that I told stories. But also same with marketing consultant. I didn't have any experience in marketing. I started out as a freelance writer, and I just decided to start writing for people because I also liked writing. But I discovered that the analysis and assessment skills that I learned when I was in the intelligence community, when I was in the Army, actually lent themselves very well to assessing marketing patterns and developing, iterating plans and so on and so forth, which is how I got into marketing consulting. I was able to produce results, and people seemed to not really care so much if I didn't have a degree or something like that in the area. Well, correction, they cared if I was trying to get employed, but in terms of hiring a consultant, they were like, you get results, so we're going to give you money, but not health insurance. So but I just came a little disillusioned with the space in general. I felt like I wanted to help people more and have more of a human element to my work. And marketing had kind of watered down that human experience to numbers, essentially, right? And numbers and actions and what caused action versus not, and so on and so forth. And So I was like, "You know what? Let me try something else." And I still needed to make money, right? Because we got bills. And I was like, "Okay, so perhaps I will give audiobook narration a try." I had done one audiobook just as kind of like a hobby thing, and I was like, "If I can find more people who are willing to pay me to do it, then I'll keep doing it." And that was in January of 2022. Uh, on New Year's Day, I sent my first audition to another author, and I got that book. And then I sent another one, and I got that book, and it just continued to go. And now we're in 2025, and that's what I tell people. Well, people are still paying me, and I still love it, so, we're still doing it.
Nice. I personally love hearing stories about people that career pivot because it's one incredibly admirable because that must be so scary. And I just love hearing when people kind of find success in different careers, especially kind of like later in life, because
Mhm.
I feel like sometimes, especially in the indie publishing industry, there can be a little bit of a, oh, I'm coming to it a little bit late. But I
Yeah.
love that there's always a time to try something new and to kind of pivot from it. So if we roll back a little bit, so if did you create an audiobook just for fun? Like how did the process, like how did you learn about the narration from going from being really good at storytelling to actually sitting down and recording something or sending auditions? What did that look like?
So this was during my marketing career phase, and I came across a blog post that said, and for if any of my audiobook narrator friends are still in the chat, they're gonna laugh because we've talked about this before. We think that we all saw the same blog post, but it was called 10 Ways to Get Paid to Read. And being a marketing consultant, I'm like, okay, so these all might be trash. These all might be trash. Like when they say get paid, like in my mind, I'm like, maybe I can pay some bills with this. But sometimes when they say get paid, they mean like buy your coffee, right? So I was like, maybe these won't be for me, but let's see. And one of the ways was audiobook narration. Now, because this was my second career and on all the things I had learned about marketing, I knew that they had definitely oversimplified it in the few paragraphs that they devoted to describing what narrating an audiobook was like. So I was already fully prepared for that. But I was like, you know what, let me give it a try. And they said, go on acx.com. So I was like, bet acx.com. And then they said, create a profile. And so I did. And then I found a book that I thought sounded awesome. Thought it sounded right up my alley. And I auditioned for it. And I sent that audition fully prepared to never hear back ever again. Like it was one of those things I so completely blessed and released that audition. I was just fully prepared to move on with my life. And the very next day, the author emailed me back and was like, "Oh my gosh, you're exactly what I wanted. This sounds so amazing," et cetera, so on and forth, so forth. And so I just did that in 2019 just for fun. Like, I was just like, "Okay, yeah." So I just did, a chapter or 2 a day. The author wasn't super pressed on deadlines, and I was like, "Cool," and I was able to still do all of my marketing stuff, for my business there. And that's how it started, and so I was able to kind of learn, a lot about the audiobook production process through that first book. Um, and so for me, it was kind of like I had a microphone because I had a podcast. I had no idea, no knowledge whatsoever about sound treatment. Again, being my second career, I knew for sure that I did not want to learn how to do like very intense engineering on my own audio. So I outsourced my engineering from the beginning because again, for me, it was a hobby, so I didn't mind like sending some money that way for an engineer. And bless him because I still work with him, but the space I recorded in, for anybody who's seen any of my TikTok videos or anything, was just my office. I put a towel underneath my microphone so that way my sound wouldn't reverberate off of my desk, but I just recorded in my big office. The only redeeming quality it had was that I had a lot of books in there. I still have a lot of books in there, but that was where that first audiobook was narrated. And that's why I say bless him because he did so much work. He must have done so much work on my audio to make it sound decent and to meet spec. But that's how it started. And then I didn't do another audiobook for quite some time because 2019 in the fall was when that audiobook got published. We finished it and it got published. But we all know what happened in Q1 of 2020. And I have 4 kids and a husband. So they were all home, which meant that, I didn't have this nice booth space where, people can make some noise, but not a lot. When I was recording in my office, you couldn't make any noise or else my microphone was going to pick it up for sure. So that's why I didn't like even think about doing another one or considering it as like a full career path until 2022 when I was like, I think it's time for a change.
I'm taking tips from you now. So I'm like, okay, I'm recording in too open an office, and I should probably have a towel under this microphone. So, okay, thank you for those. I'm taking those notes.
Okay.
There's a question from Richard coming up here. Through your time in the industry, do more or less writers want audiobook narrators who are famous actors? So I guess I think like I know for sure readers follow narrators regardless of fame. They kind of become their own fame. But have you
Yeah.
seen anything from your perspective on authors like choosing narrators?
So I would say that celebrity narration tends to happen more in the traditional publishing realm because if a celebrity narrator is going to be paid for the audiobook, a traditional publisher is the one who's footing that bill. And so it's not something that we tend to even have as a consideration for uh as for indie authors or more at, like, this kind of smaller publishing arena, because you in order to have a celebrity narrator, you gotta have celebrity narrator dollars. So I would say that it's not been a huge consideration, um, and I think also, having a celebrity narrator in general, while it may, cause some headlines and cause a stir, it's still gonna be dependent upon the individual actor, whether or not they're gonna be able to, transition away from the fact that in most of their work, if they're a famous actor, I'm assuming like a visual actor, you see them in TV or, on movies, they're gonna have to, kinda transition and kinda sidestep a little bit and realize, like, I'm not gonna have all these visual cues to help like, to be a part of conveying this entire story to somebody who's listening. When somebody is listening, you are all the cues. You are everything, at least in a traditional audiobook versus, like, something more like an immersive audio drama. You are everything, and you are conveying everything, and so, for even and of course, audiobook narration is to everyone's taste, but, I've listened to some where I'm like, "Ah, I don't know if this is really for me," because, there's a certain, quality that I'm looking for in terms of the audiobooks that I enjoy. I tend to favor audiobooks that kinda, have a similar style to what I perform because I perform it because I enjoy it, so
Well, let's talk about the performance part for a second because, like you were saying with acting, like voice acting is something totally different than like screen acting, and that wasn't necessarily your background. So I'm kind of curious: how do you find the right voice that you're going for with the story? Do you collab with the authors on that, or is it kind of do they give you free reign to play around with what you think suits the story that you're reading?
yes, to all of those things. And so a lot of my work is directly with authors, and so when it's directly with authors, we do have a lot of a collaborative process kind of going back and forth. It's part of my preparation process to send authors, like, character samples, for example. For any character that speaks more than, like, 3 times or if it, like, spans like, if they speak a little bit, but it kinda spans the book, like, I'm probably developing a character sample for that because what I don't wanna happen is for the author to be like, "Oh, actually, this person was supposed to sound like this," and then I gotta go back and record the character's voice again. I would just rather know that from the beginning.
Mhm.
And so we'll go back and forth a bit. Usually for voices, I always ask the authors, like, do you have a series Bible, a book Bible, any of that type of stuff? Like, go ahead and send it my way. Because I've found that for a lot of authors, maybe they'll even say, like, oh no, just do what you want. And I'm like, cool. I'm going to do what I want. And then I want you to check these character samples because I've found that for a lot of authors, once they hear it, they don't have a choice. Like, they don't have a decision already made sometimes. But once they hear it, all of a sudden, they may not know exactly what they wanted, but they know that that wasn't quite right. And so then that kind of gives you a starting point to move forward. If we're working through a production company, then I'm always supposed to go through the producer. And so the producer will be my connection to the author. So if I have any questions or anything like that, those will be things that I'll relay to the producer. And then, if necessary, the producer will relay that to the author and then give me the information back. So by naturally working with a production company, it tends to be a little less collaborative, but it doesn't mean that all doors are closed and I can't ask any questions whatsoever. And then with characters, I kind of just play around with them. And that's also why I like to do the character samples because it's not just for the author. It also gives me a chance to kind of play with voices not just for the character in isolation, but within the context of the story. And sometimes, with these plot twists that authors weave in and things like that, it may be to my benefit to have a character that has a voice that's almost counterintuitive until the grand reveal at the end, where we find out that they're the villain, in fact. And this whole time we thought they were the main character's best friend or something. So it's on an individual character basis, but it's also within the context of the story and what's going to serve the greater performance as a whole.
Yeah, it sounds like a really collaborative process. And I'm just curious, have you ever jumped on, because a lot of indie authors are writing in long series. Have you ever narrated like book 3? Or are you generally doing like the whole series? And if you are jumping in, do you listen to the other narration, or is it, I don't know, does that happen?
Yeah, so it does happen, and it happens for a variety of reasons. So I haven't had the experience of jumping in later on a long series and like replacing a whole narrator exactly, but I did just this last at the end of last year, I did a series of books, like the last 3 books in a series for Dreamscape Audio. It was a sci-fi fantasy or sci-fi romance series written by Elizabeth Stevens, and I did books 7, 8, and 9 in that series. Now, what made this, I think, less disruptive to listeners is that they were a series of interconnected. I hesitate to call them standalones exactly, because there certainly is a greater thread that kind of weaves through them. But if you just wanted to jump in, like probably like my mom's going to do, and listen to just 7, 8, and 9, because my mom feels like no other audiobook narrators exist. I don't know what to tell any of my friends. I'm trying to get her to listen to some other people because I can't narrate all the books in the world. But like for that series in particular, like I said, I did 7, 8, and 9. But there were other narrators on the other books before that. But like I said, I think for the listeners, it wasn't like a huge deal. At least for most of them. I'm sure there were some who were like, "No, don't replace my favorite," and I'm like, "I'm really sorry if I replaced your favorite." But in general, in terms of the series, because it was different main characters for each book, it wasn't maybe as unexpected, or because I know readers really like it when a series like sticks through with a single narrator when it's like a continuing story, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, so and in terms of listening, I did kind of touch the samples. Like I listened to the samples a little bit, just to kind of hear where the other narrators kind of took their role. But I'm far enough along in my career now, and then I think even at the beginning, because again, while this is like my third career, it is my third career, and so I've learned that people come to me for me. So they're not coming to me for me to sound like someone else. And so
Mhm.
that was something I knew I wanted when I started this, is I want people to come to me for my style and my performance. I don't want anybody to come to me because they want me to sound like someone else. I said this yesterday. I was like, I don't want to be a sock puppet, like for the author. Like the author's not sticking their hand up, to parrot their words out of me the way that they exactly want. I want them to trust me and appreciate my style and what I'm bringing to the project. And so I listened to the samples just to kind of see where other people took it. But I tried to rest or center myself in the fact that I would not have been chosen if there wasn't something from me that they wanted from this project. So it's a
Mhm.
bit of a balancing act.
Nice. We have a question here, and I'm not too sure. I'm sure the cost part of this question varies, but how long would it take to narrate a 200-page book?
So pages, in terms of a metric, are not as helpful as word count. And so we typically go with word count. And so the industry standard for one finished hour of audio, and that's like the finished hour is what you hear on Audible or Libro FM or Kobo,
Yeah.
right? Go listen to your stuff on Kobo. All of our stuff is on Kobo. Shameless plug for the both of us. Kobo Plus for the win. Um, but so 9,300 words, 9,300 words is the industry standard for what's in one finished hour, right? And so if you have a word count for your manuscript and you take it and divide it by 9,300 words, which is like what I would do anyway if somebody emailed me, I would ask for the word count. I would divide it by 9,300, and that'll give us our estimated uh, finished hours for when the project is done. And one finished hour of audio can take somewhere between 1 to 3 hours to record. It just kind of depends. So for books where I'm using an accent that I'm really familiar with, whether it's General American or like maybe it's General American and I'm also throwing in a Spanish accent, maybe a British accent and stuff. Those are accents I can do really easily. So it's very, it's smooth and pretty quick for me to transition between them. But if there's accents in there that like I have, but I need to like kind of prepare my mouth. We call it moving into an oral posture. At least that's what I call it, I guess. I don't know. But I have to move into the right oral posture. And so I have like phrases that I'll say to help move my mouth and kind of capture that sound, which means I have to pause and I have to do that. And then I got to resume recording. So it can take longer. And then just on days where your stomach is rumbly and now you have to retake something because your stomach decided it wanted to be an unpaid actor in this audiobook, which you don't want, of course. So it takes anywhere between 1 to 3 hours is usually the ratio. And then because I outsource my engineering, that's a financial cost for me, not a time cost. So it's like for me, and it'll depend different for every narrator. I usually aim for like an hour of finished audio done a day. It allows me to have like a work-life balance that I really enjoy. But every now and then I have projects that need to be done sooner. Like if I'm working with a publisher, so I might have to aim for 2 hours of finished audio in a day, but that's usually a short-term kind of sprint for me. And then in terms of cost, every single narrator and like company will have their own price ranges. Currently, I have my fees on my website. A lot of my narrator friends do that as well, but some don't. And so sometimes you have to reach out to find out. But because mine are already on my website, I can give you an example. So for me, it's $300 per finished hour. And so that's the increment that we use. And so what that means is that you're not paying me for the 1 to 3 hours of time that I spend recording each hour of audio. If I deliver, if your audiobook is 10 hours long, that's the finished hours, and I'm $300 per finished hour, then your audiobook has cost you $3,000. So when you typically contract with a narrator, unless they tell you otherwise, you're getting finished audio that's ready to upload. And that's my process. That's why I work with my own engineer. You could certainly, if you reached out to me like, hey, what about just raw audio? I have somebody who can engineer it for me, because people have friends in music and things like that. Then it's like, okay, well, we can talk about a raw audio cost, which is still per finished hour, even though the hours aren't technically finished, but it just refers to the amount of audio that I'm delivering to you. But then after that, my responsibility is done there because you are taking on the role of having it engineered.
I think it's good to highlight that one finished hour does not equal 1 hour of your work. Yeah, I feel like 3 hours is probably a good metric, but yeah, it's good to highlight that piece. So you also work as a sensitivity reader, and I was wondering if we could chat about that a little bit. And if anyone who is watching isn't familiar, could you tell us what a sensitivity reader does and why and when an author might consider using one?
Yes. Okay. So it's still a relatively new concept in publishing. So to me, it feels like one of those things that if you ask, I feel like in general, you should get around about some very similar answers, but everybody's going to have kind of a different spin on it. But in terms of sensitivity reading, I consider that role to be someone kind of like an editor in a way. And so, what typically happens is, as a sensitivity reader, if an author is writing a story that is outside the realm of their lived experiences, like the identities that they hold and so on and so forth, they may want a second set of eyes on the manuscript. And who you choose to hire would be dependent on things like, does that person have the lived experience that you're interested in terms of having your manuscript assessed? But there may be other skills that you also would find valuable. So in my case, on my website for my page about this, I include the fact that like I've got my bachelor's in social psychology. I have a couple emotional intelligence certifications. I have a certificate in business ethics, which leaned very heavily on things like critical thinking and emotional intelligence. And so just kind of that demonstration of somebody who's able to, and I think people who are able to kind of look at things from multiple perspectives tend to be able to offer some of the best quality feedback to an author. The goal is not to tear a manuscript into shreds. I've often, if I've found something, I've highlighted something, indicated that this might be a problem, or, maybe this was unintentionally reliant on, harmful stereotypes and things like that. It's not that I'm just like throwing that problem back at the author. With my work, all of my stuff includes a 60-minute consultation afterwards to go over any questions that somebody might have. And those often turn into brainstorming sessions that, and, not to toot my own horn. And again, it's a collaborative environment, just like audiobook narration, but between the two of us in terms of that session right there, we're often able to develop solutions to what I've found that may be, harmful in such a way that actually deepens things like world building or adds more complexity to the plot. So the goal is never to take away from a manuscript, but to critically engage with it in a way that you are speaking the message that you intend. So if your intention is not to showcase stereotypes, then let's see how we can make changes and to better align with your vision for this manuscript instead of it, potentially unintentionally depicting things that were completely outside the realm of your vision.
It sounds like you work collaboratively across all of the things that you do, and you've maybe answered this a little bit, and also toot your own horn as loudly as you would like. But I feel like if an author is using a sensitivity reader, they're probably already open to feedback. But do you have any advice for authors on receiving feedback, as that can be hard? I feel like everyone is well-intentioned. I mean, actually, maybe not, but most people are well-intentioned.
Most are,
Do you have
definitely.
any advice on how authors can just receive feedback?
Yes, absolutely. Sit with it. Pause. The inclination, because keep in mind, so sensitivity reading is typically a paid service. I do it as a paid service. Um, and so if that's what you're doing, if you are paying someone for this feedback, right? Um, it can make you feel a type of way. And I try to do this with all of my reports. I don't tend to speak to the author in any such way. I will refer to things that were written, instances that were described. So we're talking about the manuscript here, right? And it's always moving from the point, like the belief, the knowledge in my case, that all of us have unconscious bias and stereotypes and all types of things that we haven't unpacked yet. It's just a lifelong process, right? So in this case, it's me trying to help you, but that's the thing. It's me trying to help you. So if I send you something and you're like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe all these things that Ruthie found in my manuscript, take a breath, because I'm not over here, and anybody who's doing this as a service, honestly, we're going out of our way to help. So they're not over here like, oh, this person's a terrible person. Look at all these things. I can't believe this. How awful of them, because you actively sought out assistance. So that's definitely not the perspective that we're sitting here holding. And so I think sitting with it is probably one of the best things. And if you need to, set it aside. Like I'm sending you this report in an email, so it's not like you have to respond right back to me. I didn't call you, and you're ignoring my phone calls, right? You can sit with this now. If you want to take a couple days, you totally can. And that's the reason that I actually don't have authors schedule their call with me until after I've sent them the report, because I want them to have the chance to be with the report as long as possible before we get on a call. And sometimes you'll read things in the report initially that you're like, I don't think she's right about this. I definitely didn't do that. So take time, check my work, check me. I've had authors who are like, you said this was in there, but I just couldn't believe it. And then I went back and looked and I realized that you were right, that I actually did not include this or did include that. And I was like, yeah, no, it's totally fine. I double checked myself like 3 times to make sure that I was right. So I totally vibe with that for sure. But I think pausing, and then remember the intention of your sensitivity reader. The intention of your sensitivity reader is to help you. So if their goal is to help you, and even if you don't agree with them or you don't think that they're right, that's okay. And this is also why I intend to include sources in my reports. I will put an issue in its own little group. I'll write about it, and then I will include sources to show that, like, while this is my impression, this is what informs my perspective. So it gives you an opportunity to click and read and hear from more people that aren't just me, to understand what informs my particular assessment of, that issue in your manuscript.
Yeah, it sounds so thorough. And I guess the main takeaway really is that it is a collaboration with the intention of just making the book better and making more readers want to read it. So I think, yeah, it sounds like you're doing good stuff.
Thank you.
Could you tell us a bit about your company and No Market for that book, and what inspired you to find it, to start the company?
Yeah, so I toyed around with the name. The name is sometimes something people are like, wow, why did you pick that name? But most of the authors who work with me are, in one shape, form, or another, are writing diverse and inclusive stories, whether that's because they are what we would call, writing stories that are own voices, which means that they are writing stories that stem from their lived identities, as whether they're racialized people, which is another word for Black, brown, indigenous, like other people of color, like BIPOC people, whether they're queer people, whether they're disabled people, other types of marginalized people. They're writing these own voices stories, whether they are authors who want to write inclusively of identities that they themselves do not hold, but perhaps want to write stories that reflect the broader world that they feel that they and others experience. Um, but oftentimes when they do that, they have heard at some point probably, there's no market for that book. And so for the people that it's for, when they see it, they're like, ah, okay, this person knows what, kind of a little bit of what my struggle is. So that's where the name came from.
I love the
Now,
name, by the way, because that
oh,
it just speaks to uh, the great thing about indie publishing as well is that people see that there is a market for everything. Like there are readers looking for all sorts of books. So
yes.
I think it's a great company name.
Thank you so much. And so that was how I developed the name. And it was kind of from this idea, like I do own the URL for my name, Ruthie Bowles, but in my mind, I'm like, you never know what something's going to turn into. So that's why I tend to go with like brand names for like my URLs and things like that, because you just never know what something's going to turn into. And I learned that with my first company as well. And so that first company, that marketing company, which you probably appreciate this name, but it was called Defy the Status Quo. And it was because the status quo of marketing content was that it was blah and boring. So I was like, well, let's actively seek to go beyond that and get real results. And so that's where that name came from. But notice it doesn't say marketing in there,
Mm.
right? And so it's like, I don't know what this is going to turn into. So I want to leave the door open a little bit. I want something that speaks to my values, but I don't know what it's going to turn into. So let's go ahead and leave some doors and windows open for that. Um, and so initially it was the URL for my company, for my website. And it was kind of like, okay, as a narrator, I often, am responsible for the entire realm of production for audiobooks, especially when I work directly with indie authors. So it made sense. And then I added in, like, I was just talking on TikTok and then educating on TikTok and talking about different things that can pop up in books. And then people started reaching out to me and asking, well, do you sensitivity read? And I'm like, I remember the first time somebody asked me, I was like, let me Google it, I guess, but that very first person who asked me was an author friend who was pretty close to me. And then another person asked me the next month, and I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I should, one person was a little bit of a surprise, but two people, a month apart, that seems like maybe starting to be a pattern. So I made a website page for it, on my website. So now it wasn't just audiobook narration, it was also, diversity consulting, because I also do like 60-minute consultation calls before you start writing. Like if you have questions, if you like have your kind of rough plot in your head and you want to talk about any of the potential things that might come up, like I also do those too. And so, as that's kind of, I started to build that out, and that was on the website. I was like, okay, well, now I'm offering multiple services, and here we are. And then it became a bit more when some of my authors and I decided to jump ship off of Audible's exclusivity and started kind of engaging in what we refer to as a wide royalty share relationship. I was in royalty share plus arrangements with these authors over on Audible, and we were just really chafing at the exclusivity restrictions and what it kept us from being able to do. And so, I wrote up a proposal. I asked my authors who'd be interested in hearing about it. I got quite a few hands. So I was like, okay, I'm going to write this proposal. I structured out, planned the business and all types of elements. The authors went back and forth with me on it, gave me some feedback, refined it. We ended up with a contract. And then it was end of August 2024 that I started publishing under no market for that book as an audio publisher. And then it was at the start of this year that we started buying some of our first sets of audio rights. And so really all of that development was to try and meet different needs and wants that I saw in the industry, whether it was for more authors or more narrators of color, more narrators from marginalized backgrounds, whether it was helping people with their manuscripts because they want to write diversely and inclusively, and then whether it was because, it was a bit financially inaccessible to go outside of like an arrangement like Royalty Share Plus, but the restrictions just did not align with our values, because you can't have your audiobooks in libraries. Then you can't have your audiobooks if they're exclusive to Audible. Then you can't have them in Kobo Plus, which can make things a lot more financially accessible to people. And so those were things that were really chafing at my values. I was online talking about the importance of things like equity and accessibility, but a lot of my work just wasn't accessible. It wasn't, equitably accessible, because people get audiobooks from where they want to get them, and you can get them in the library and get them off of Kobo. But if you like Kobo or you like Libro FM, then you can get them there, and you choose what you want to do, and you choose what and then you choose what you want to do, and you do what you can. Right. And so we wanted to kind of widen that. And then in terms of purchasing audio rights, I wanted to offer as best as I could payment terms and, production options that I felt more readily acknowledged the author's importance as the intellectual property creator, and whether that was with what I considered, more fair pay structures or something like that. Like that's why we started doing that, and it was with authors who I was like, hey, I'm not trying to have you do something you don't want to do, but these were authors who are already like, I want you to narrate the book, the whole thing, do it. And I was like, okay, great. Well, since that's what you want anyway, would you be interested in? And so it's also kind of created different streams of revenue for my company, but also enabled perhaps audiobook production in ways that might not be possible. And I do look forward to growing all of the various arms. But that's what it was. The community, the industry, the segment of the industry, the segment of the community that I sit in talks routinely about the things that they need and the things that they want. And I wanted to be a part of fulfilling those needs and helping satisfy those wants.
Yeah, you talked about definitely making kind of equitable and accessible royalty structure for people that want books narrated in a sort of a widely published way. What are some of the other challenges facing kind of like marginalized authors in publishing today? I know that's a very large question, but I'm just, and how can we support authors from marginalized communities better?
Absolutely. So publishing is a pretty big realm, so if you don't mind, I'll narrow it a
Of
little
course.
bit more down to, like, audiobooks.
Yeah.
But we can still look at it through the lens of publishing, right? So, it's in terms of books that are going to get audiobooks, publishers have certainly been a lot better about making audiobooks for books, but, just like with things like marketing and book placement when, an author's got a new release, marginalized authors are less likely to get that marketing space, right? And so if they're less likely to get marketing space, it also means that it's also possible that they're less likely to have as much have as many options for their audiobooks. And so when we flip it and we look kind of like at narrator options, uh, there are less marginalized narrators. And then when you start to look at, okay, we would like to do own voices casting, which a lot of companies do prioritize own voices casting, which would mean, if you have a black uh, main character, you would endeavor to cast a black narrator for that part. So that's like just a very easy example of own voices. But at the same time, it can be a struggle if companies, whether they're publishing companies who have audiobook arms or production companies, if they have not gone out of their way to kind of cultivate a roster that includes marginalized people, it can kind of leave them scrambling to find somebody to fill this need that they now suddenly have, which can lead them to turn to the same narrators over and over again. It kind of shuts the door in terms of new voices. And so I think that unfortunately, just from a systemic way, so this isn't me accusing anybody specifically of anything, but just from a systemic way, it can make it so marginalized authors who would put a high value on own voices casting for their stories that are the stories of marginalized characters or feature marginalized characters, right? Because a Latina FMC fighting a dragon is is also great, and if the author wants a Latina narrator, then they deserve to have her. But if it's not done in advance to kind of create this awareness of who's out in the industry, who's coming up into the industry, then it can give marginalized authors let
Oh no. Oh, Ruthie has dropped. Let me try and get her back. Apologies now for this interruption. You're back.
I am. I don't know what happened.
Oh, it's okay.
I'm just trying to fix my camera so I can go back to the other one.
No problem. Do you want me to take you off while you fix that for a sec, or are you
I
good with
think
it?
it's okay. Yeah,
There we
we're
go.
good.
I love this double angle that you had going, though. It's like we're
Yeah.
getting a 360 view.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
It was probably just a quick glitch in my internet or something. But yeah, so it's not something that's actively done intentionally, but the impact is the result, right? That marginalized authors may not have as much variety, for whom they might have any input in, for who gets to narrate their audiobook, and that doesn't always feel great when you know that if you're white or so marginalized as an umbrella term refers to a lot of different kinds of marginalization. So I will roll back specifically to racialized authors. So if you as a racialized author know that you got 3 audition samples, let's say, to pick from your publisher or production company, but you know that, talking with a white author peer that you have, even a white author friend that you have, you know that they got 5 or 6 or 7, or maybe their book was optioned to have dual narration instead of solo narration, and you're not getting that, and you feel like your manuscripts are fairly similar. That may be a result of the fact that it can be harder for production companies and publishing houses to find marginalized narrators on the fly because it's not something that's readily cultivated in their roster. So I think that that's probably one symptom of a larger issue within publishing in terms of what makes things a little bit harder for marginalized authors. Like, do they get an audiobook in the end? Yes. But you still have to kind of sit with that knowledge that perhaps your audiobook wasn't able to receive as much as it could have just due to systemic issues that are just present in publishing that we as a collective have to work to overturn.
Mhm. Thank you for outlining that. I really appreciate it, and the work that you're doing on your website as well to like offer the fact that you're putting out these audiobooks yourself too. I think that's a great point about having this diverse catalog of narrators available to kind of improve the books that are out there.
Mhm.
Um, Tamara's asked a question. I'm going to pop it up. I feel like we've kind of covered the royalties, but just can you speak to the partnership collaboration you offer with authors with respects to royalties?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on what we're doing. So with the wide royalty share, we kind of follow that royalty share plus model. So I'll have like and a lot of authors or a lot of narrators who do like royalty share plus specifically will offer something similar. So whether it's royalty share plus specifically on Audible or whether a narrator is doing something like what I'm doing, although I was the only person who I knew who was doing this for quite some time, and then one of my narrator friends who was here at the beginning has started to set up something similar for herself and her narration partner. But it's usually a reduced PFH rate, right? And then we split the royalties 50-50, which is very similar to what I would do if I was on Audible's Royalty Share Plus. It's a reduced PFH rate. So instead of $300 PFH, it'll be a lower rate, and then splitting the royalties 50-50. In terms of audiobook acquisition, things like advances can be negotiated, certainly. But then the structure that I've tried to do is a 30-40-50% model, which so like when we're working on earning back the advance, 30% of the royalties go to the author. When we're working on earning back production cost, 40% of the royalties go to the author. And then once those two prerequisites have been satisfied, it then goes to 50% to no market for that book, and then 50% for the author. Now, everybody and anybody who's willing to give setting something like this up a go, it's going to be completely on them. This was something that I felt was like it respected the fact that like my company was putting up the initial investment, like we had acquired the rights, paid you in advance, like shouldered the production cost, all the things that you would expect a company that's acquiring audio rights to do, right? Um, but at the same time, recognizing that once those things kind of have been satisfied, like it is still a collaborative relationship because the author is still going to continue marketing those books. And of course, we want them to market the fact that they have an audiobook. But then also from my end, like this year was the start of me showing up at events and not just showing up as Ruthie the narrator, but also showing up as no market for that book and selling audiobooks on site, which is something that we're able to do because we're not exclusive. And we have the infrastructure to sell audiobooks on site. Listeners were surprised that it was an option. They certainly were, but they weren't so surprised that they weren't willing to buy the audiobooks in person. And so I just want to keep that very open. And again, even that like those types of royalty structures were things that I consulted with my authors about and things that I researched to determine, because for me, I want to have a very ethical approach to the business. And by, doing things like direct selling and making things accessible, for me, it kind of creates that trifecta of winning. It's not just a win between me and the author. It's a win-win-win because it's also a win for the listeners who are now able to access those audiobooks, even if it's from someplace like Hoopla, which they can access for free via their local library, as long as their library has a platform, has Hoopla or Libby in some cases. So it's just really want to make sure that that's clear. It's not an industry standard thing that I'm doing by any stretch of the imagination. There are plenty of industry, like longtime industry professionals that are like, don't do it. And I'm like, I hear you. But and that's the thing. And I was very upfront with all of my authors too. Like, hey, so we're going to do this. And if it doesn't work, right? Like, we can always go back to what we had before. That's the thing. Is like, if this doesn't work, like none of us are dying, right? Like, would it suck if it doesn't work? Sure. But like, if it doesn't work, then we can always go back to what we had before, which wasn't what we preferred, but still worked for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, industry standards don't change until you challenge them and then prove that something else can also work. So the theme of collaboration is strong throughout this conversation. I really like that about the work that you're doing. And audiobooks are definitely something that's on the rise in popularity. I think people are thinking outside of, just one platform, especially with Spotify entering the market. There's just more people listening to audio than ever before. So I wonder, where do you see the industry going?
Ooh, I do agree. Definitely. More people are listening to audio than ever before. Um, and at first, I feel like pre some technological advancements, it just kind of felt like audiobooks would continue kind of like on the rise, and it would be a good relationship, a good happening for everybody, authors, publishing companies, narrators, because it would mean that there was more possible work for everybody, and another format of an intellectual property to leverage to satisfy this growing desire to hear stories told, which is the oldest format for storytelling. We were exchanging oral stories long before we learned how to put pen to paper or burnt stick to wall or whatever it is that we were doing. Um, and so I do think that we will continue to see growth. I think the type of growth, if that growth is going to continue to be collaborative and inclusive, is largely going to depend on how well we're able to uh, kind of draw the lines for things like generative AI. Um, because the way that I see it, we have authors who are artists of the written word. And if an author doesn't approach their work that way, that's totally fine. But most of the authors that I have worked with genuinely see themselves as written creatives. And yes, they would like to make money from their art, but they are writing kind of from like this soul place, right, where their creativity resides, and they have these stories that they feel that they should tell, that they are doing a service to anybody who encounters their work by telling these stories, right? So that's why they tell them. As a narrator, I too am an artist. I am a voice artist, right? An oral audio artist, if you will. And I perform from that same place. Do I love my work? Absolutely. It certainly helps me pay the bills, but that's not the only reason I do it, because as I've demonstrated, I could pick up I could take my ball and go home and go do something else if that's what I wanted to do. And now, this being my third career, I'm fully confident in that fact. It's a little liberating in a way to know that I am here because I want to be here, not because I have to be here. But I perform from that same place, that kind of same like soul space where I feel like my creativity is, because I have a belief that for the people that enjoy my performance style, this is the way for them to hear it, where the listener, it will touch them deeply, for whatever journey that it is that we're on, whether we're laughing or crying or screaming. Like sometimes it's scary, but that's the journey that they're on, and I have the privilege and the honor of being the vehicle for them for that. Now, where it comes, I think the biggest rub is going to be kind of like that business aspect a little bit, as particularly when you look at things like publishers and distributors. So the people who benefit the most when indiscriminate generative AI, in my opinion, right? This is all my opinion. These are my opinions and not the opinions of anybody that I'm affiliated with. But when we look at, okay, the demand for audiobooks is rising, it's a little disappointing to me that instead of being like, hey, how can we make more audiobooks by tapping all of these narrators that we have? Do we have enough narrators for everything? No, but you clearly have a lot of actors or actresses, acting professionals who would be willing to kind of consider it if they had the knowledge. And I think that it probably would have been a bit more beneficial to kind of tap those pools of people, and work on things like education and stuff like that to expand the opportunities that were available to humans, before jumping to a solution that essentially stripped the humanity out of the creative work that you were then producing for sale to meet. And so for me, it always felt like a very financial decision, especially when you consider in general how expensive generative AI is. So I think we're at a turning point, basically. I say all that to say that we are at a critical turning point. And, you know, that turning point, we'll have to see which direction that we go in. But I am here, and I know a lot of my creative friends are here, for the same reasons, and we love the creative work that we do, and we love doing it with authors who love their work. So
I like the phrase that you used. Was it kind of like the soul center that you're coming
yes,
from with the work
yes,
that you're doing? I'm
yes.
wondering, because you've built a few different brands online now, do you have any advice for authors who want to build a brand and stay authentic? So maybe like tapping into that soul center in an online presence, because I feel it can be hard to, I mean, people respond to authenticity, but I always wonder about the balance of like putting so much of yourself on like an online presence versus kind of your business. So do you have any advice
No.
on that?
Yes, yes. So that was actually a big part of my marketing work, was authentic brand development. I talked about for quite some time, I talked about something, a term I called radical authenticity,
Mm.
because people do mistake authenticity with like this oversharing,
Right.
right? And so that's not actually what authenticity is about. Your authenticity can have scales. It's more about the consistent presentation. So if you know anything about me, then you know that like Ruthie, cares about fairness. Ruthie cares about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ruthie cares about things like authenticity, integrity, and those types of things. So, but like authenticity is important to me, but my children aren't plastered all over the internet. I don't get on Twitter or Threads and tell everybody about how irritating my husband was because he did X thing, or, how frustrated I am with this producer because they didn't answer my email for 3 days, or whatever, and that's actually not typical. I've had pretty good experiences with most of my producers. So please don't try to pick that apart, anybody who's listening, to figure out who it is. But that's not what being authentic is about. Being authentic, and what I would say radically authentic, to borrow that term from my second career, is understanding what's important to you. What are your values? Because if you don't anchor into what's important to you, you will blow every which way, and that will give the impression of like the opposite. Inauthenticity is when you cannot be counted on for anything. And so in terms of brand building, I always encourage people to think about what's important. Don't start with what you want to present. Start with what's important to you, because as a solopreneur, as a small business owner, which is essentially what all of us are, if you're a publisher, if you're a narrator, if you're an author, any type of creative, like you're a small business owner, you need to decide what's important to you, because you have to show up for this on the good days and the bad days. And if you only think about what you want to present, the facade that you've created. A lot of people treat brands like facades. If you only think about the facade that you want to present on your bad days, you're not going to be able to show up for it. On your meh days, you're probably not going to be able to show up for it. You're only going to be able to show up for it when you have that energy to put on that mask and to be online or be wherever it is that you are, because of the facade that you've presented. So the most important things, I think, are thinking about what's important to you and what makes you feel genuine, what feels genuine to you. Because if you're going to be authentic with anyone, you have to first be authentic with yourself. And if you are telling yourself lies, if you are masking with yourself, if you're not willing to be honest with yourself and kind of generate a certain amount of self-awareness, there's absolutely no way that you are going to be able to get on the internet, right? 2025 and then be honest with other people and authentic with other people when you're not being authentic with yourself. And then the only other thing I would add, just because this, like, I used to give classes on this. So
I know, I just want to keep listening to what you're saying. And
and yeah.
but they
So
love your definition as well about the radical authenticity. So.
thank you. So concentric circles of trust. So this was a concept I started talking about kind of with radical authenticity, because people are like, well, how do I do this without oversharing? Like, what is it? Concentric circles of trust. The very center circle, that's you. Right? Which goes back to what I just said. You have to be willing to be authentic with yourself, which means not just acknowledging your good things, but also the areas where you have space for growth. What is your growing edge? I heard that a lot at a conference this weekend. So what's your growing edge, right? Where's the space where you have the most capacity for growth? Those are the areas we tend to ignore the most, or the ones where we have the most capacity for development. But if that's first circle is you, whatever you can trust yourself with, right? The next circle would be probably one or two people, maybe three, that you are like, I can show up to this person on my worst day and they will still hold that space for me with love. Or maybe we're both having our worst day and it's okay for us to just collapse here quietly together. That's your second circle. And so the concentric circles of trust are or what you trust people with as you get further and further out. And it's not about masking or, once I get to this level of trust, like I'm putting on the mask, but it doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to share things with you. The people in my second circle, they're the people who get the things that would probably ruin my brand on the internet. But the thing is, in circling back to radical authenticity, your very initial inclination is probably not what's most in alignment with your values. It's probably not what you genuinely feel or what you genuinely believe, but we just have those emotional responses that aren't necessarily unhealthy. But when you take that emotional initial response and put it on the internet, that's when you create an unhealthy environment for yourself, right? So if I hear about a book that's got something in it, could be anything. And I'm just like, ugh, again, please, gosh, no, right? Like that might be my initial response, and I'm entitled to my initial response. But what always happens, especially as I'm talking with these friends that are excellent mirrors to the values that I hold, we can talk about it, and I can be like, you know what, actually, I can see how they would have come to that conclusion or how they might have ended up there in their story. I don't know if it's true because I'm not talking to them. They're not a client of mine. I just heard about it on the internet. But there's plenty of ways for this to have just been unintentional. And, my response says more about me than it does about them. They're a complete stranger to me. And so that ends up, we start to get to the person who's not the emotional response, but like the genuine, thoughtful, self-aware being that I try not to cover up with all of the emotional masks. And I think that when we approach things that way, it creates more space for that authenticity. It's not about false positivity, because I will be the first one to let y'all know when I'm like, look, today I told my friends, I was like, I feel like a exploded feather pillow being drawn in a bunch of different directions, right? And that's just the kind of day I'm having, and that's okay, and I understand that. But it's about showing up as the person that I know is in here. And if I can do that for me, then as my company grows, that'll be the standard that my company is held to, right? And that'll be what people expect from my company. And so when we move in that way, and this is actually a really important point for anybody building a brand, When you move in that way and people trust that what you say is what you mean and is what you're gonna do, whenever a controversy pops up on the internet, you don't have to say anything. There are brands that I work with still in kind of like a consulting capacity in the publishing space that just because a bad event has happened, like if there's a book event that I work with, like they don't have to get on the internet and say, "Oh, we're a good event. We're not going to take money from you and whatever. We're going to put on a quality show." They don't have to do that because they do that. So they don't have to say it because they do it. And it's the same thing. Whenever something happens on the internet, I don't have to come out and say, "I'm against this," because people already know. Because I have walked those steps, I have forged that path. And if you look behind me, that path is littered with those types of actions, not just words, but actual actions. And so when you're building a brand, as your brand gets older, if you're putting in that work, it means you don't have to be responsive to the world around you nearly to the level that a lot of people seem to believe, where they're constantly putting up these statements refuting or supporting. If you are doing the work, it will be evident that you are doing the work. And that's what you want, because that turns into a brand where people are talking about you when you're not in the room, and what they're saying is exactly what you're portraying. And that is absolutely what you want from your brand.
We have a comment here saying that's true aligned integrity.
Yes.
I love that. And you're touching on a little bit of, I don't know, we're at time here. I won't keep you for much longer, but
I'm okay.
touching on a little bit of like, there's a true lack of empathy on the internet, so teaching yourself to have empathy for yourself and for others. And I think that's really helpful advice with brand building. And I'm curious, you mentioned that you did some freelance writing. Is there any ambitions? Is there a book coming out of you anytime?
Well, I have a short story that's published, and you can listen to it on Kobo Plus. But yeah, I've contributed to a few anthologies actually over the last few years, and so I actually published one as a standalone just by itself. It's called Humanity's Sentencing, and the premise is the last human alive has been found guilty for crimes against nature by nature, and she wakes up at her sentencing hearing. So if she's the last human alive, y'all can imagine what that courtroom looked like. Um, and that was like a story I'd written for an anthology last year that just felt really timely. And currently, I'm working on a pink horror story um, that is uh, ended up deciding that it was going to be longer than I initially thought. So I thought I was almost done. I was ready to send it to the editor. And then the story was like, actually, there's a bit more here. So my best friend and writing partner has told me that I absolutely have to write all of those things that I voice noted to them down. So, and include them in the story. So that's where we're at for that. But yeah, I think we'll start getting some more out there.
Oh, sorry. Sometimes it's not your decision. The story just directs
No.
you.
No, and so if for anybody who maybe checks out Humanity's Sentencing, I need you to know that that last chapter was absolutely not planned, and I had a look of great confusion as my fingers continued to move. And this was that soul center that I was talking about. It felt like it bypassed my brain and just went right out of my fingers. And for me, that last chapter, I didn't realize how deeply like I needed that as a continuation of the story, and it just happened in the moment. I thought I was about to hit done, and then not quite, so
We've dropped a link to it in the chat, so if people are interested in
Oh.
checking it out, they can find it really easily. And then just a last question, are you reading anything good at the moment or listening to anything good at the moment?
Yes, 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 yes. The Phoenix King is what I'm listening to for fiction. So if you haven't checked that out, I highly recommend it. It's giving kind of Dune-ish vibes. I got to meet the author at the Imaginary Book Festival earlier this month in DC. If you love sci-fi fantasy and you live in the DMV area, and maybe even if you don't, you should come check out the Imaginary Book Festival for sure. And then nonfiction, you will probably appreciate this a lot, but it's a book by Loretta Ross. It's called Calling In: How to Make Change with Those You'd Rather Cancel.
Oh,
And Loretta Ross is an activist, a longtime activist. She gives workshops on calling in. And I have found, and the audiobook is really good. It's narrated by the author. And I have just found it to be something. I have been talking about these things the last couple years in terms of what I've seen in the online space, especially in the bookish space. And she's really putting some frameworks and some solid vocabulary to the things that I have already been talking about. So I've been enjoying it immensely. And I highly recommend it for anybody who's looking for for anybody who recognizes that there is a lot of good that can be done on the internet, on social media, but simultaneously recognizes that there's maybe a toxicity to the space that they don't want to be a part of. Or in my case, like having been a part of it, no longer want to be a part of it. I recognize I can't engage in those behaviors even as I was doing it as nicely as I possibly could. I can't engage in certain things because it just contributes to an overall impact that I don't want to be a part of. So, Calling In by Loretta Ross, highly recommend.
Yeah, it's in the chat as well for people to check out. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Ruthie. I feel like we could keep going, but I will let you get back to the audiobook narration that you're probably delaying working on. So can you tell viewers where they can find you online?
Absolutely. If you Google my name, Ruthie Bowles, you will find a lot on me on the interwebs, some of it spanning quite a few years, but most of the recent stuff will be audiobook narration. I'm Ruthie Narrates Books on pretty much every platform. And then, of course, nomarketforthatbook.com is my website, and you can find all of my links and things like that in there as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for everyone for viewing and for the questions and the engagement throughout. We'll be back next month. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Okay.